Sorry.
Okay.
So, this is our second webinar in the climate change series, and I wanted to welcome Soumya and Aditya, who have a lot of expertise in talking about some of the, history of climate activism as well as government policies, and which kind of bring us to, giving some context on why we're in the state that we are in today, and understand a little bit of how local bodies, people's movements have actually been trying to kind of address this issue, and how in a way there is this there are government policies and there are people's initiatives, and what's been the dynamics, what is actually also the climate politics, which I think both of them I have a lot of knowledge about, can talk about. So I'd like to begin with an introduction from both our speakers, and Soumya, you could start with yours. Yeah.
Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And see, my name is Dutta. I am a people science activist from quite a long time, and I was in convener and organizing secretary of a large All India People Science campaign called Bharat Jan Vigyan Jatha, and also the founder convener of a large school science education improvement intervention called National Children's Science Congress as the founder convener. And then I basically over the last 25 years been working with a large number of movement groups, people's movements on the ground. I work with Narmada Bachao, NAPM, Forest People's Movement, AIFM, then the coastal people's organizations, the fish workers organizations, like that. And I also intervened quite strongly over the last 12 years in the UNFCCC, that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, those conventions in multiple forums. Of course, not as a government representative, but as civil society representative. For the last 12 years, starting from COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009 of 15. And in between, for 3 years, I was member of the advisory board of the United Nations Climate Technology Center. So I have worked with groups basically in South Asia, mostly in South Asia, in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, but also in some African groups, some Latin American groups, and some European groups on different times. And today means now at the present time, I focus primarily on the related, connected issues of climate and energy. And I devote most of my time in building capacities of people's movements, in understanding and responding to this, building their resilience, raising political demands, correct political demands, and this kind of issues, mostly in South Asia. But again, I collaborate very closely with international groups like Climate Justice Now, Demand Climate Justice, CAN, Friends of the Earth International, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll definitely would like to hear more about all these groups that you're so connected with, so that the people here can understand if any of them are interested, and I hope they're interested in kind of joining, becoming part of this movement. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on this webinar. Thanks, Soumya. And Aditya, yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming, everyone. So I have been working in the climate space now for a couple of years, primarily focusing on the political and institutional angles to climate change. So we've done some research. I work at an organization called CPR, Center for Policy Research, which is a think tank, and we're supposed to advise on policy issues related to climate change. And over the last 3 years, I've done some work on exploring the history of India's climate politics, how the government has approached climate change, and what can be done at a more regional South Asia level about climate. And so before that, I used to work at a funding organization called the Asia Foundation, where we try to support civil society organizations to work on some climate issues.
Okay, and both of you have actually written also so much. Soumya has a lot of books to his name, and I know you sent me that paper which I read, and I'm sure there's more stuff where we can't get into everything. But Soumya, you touched upon some of the organizations, but if you could give some just walk us through some of the history of this climate activism, or you I think use a different term now, but whatever it is, and just talk about, especially about some of the organizations or movements that you mentioned and we discussed a little yesterday or day before yesterday as well. If you could just give an overview of those.
Okay, thanks. Yasmin. I think climate, actually, what we used to call climate movement, over the last 9-10 years, it has become much more focused into a climate justice movement globally, also in India. From India, at least the groups that we were involved with all across India, the aspect of climate justice and ecological justice was always the central focus. It was not climate change, it was the climate justice movement. But the movements globally started basically focusing on climate because the ecological movements are quite old. I'm not into that because that is a much larger, much broader category. There are multiple aspects. I will focus only on the climate change, climate crisis aspect and the climate justice movement. These basically started in the early 2000s, 2001 to with several European countries, their green parties and more radical groups. They take a lead and they're taking a clear view. They're taking a clear view that the kind of petition demands that we are making is really not good enough. And the climate system is now showing trends of going completely haywire. So, and you need a lot of issues to be addressed, which are not addressed from the justice perspective. They are being addressed from the techno perspective, techno-commercial perspective. So that was one of the major concerns from where movement, like the first global movement focused on climate justice was CJN, Climate Justice Now. And I'm very much part of that. I'm one of those from southern parts of the world, that is the southern countries, not southern hemisphere, but the southern countries. So Climate Justice Now was one of the first global groups comprising of multiple groups from mostly at that point of time, that is the 2005-6 to 2010. At that point of time, it was mainly the European groups, friends of that groups in Europe, then some of the more radical groups like Endegalande and all. So these are more radical groups. Friends of that also is a more radical group. But when I am talking about climate justice movement, let me make it very clear. I am not talking about corporate friendly, government friendly groups like WWF and others. They are not part of this. They are looked at a very, very different perspective. Not even NRDC, WWF, these groups I am not at all talking about. These are groups which are focused on justice that I am talking about. And in that justice perspective, climate and ecological justice is a central component. So globally, I'll make it short. Globally, Climate Justice Now was first major platform or movement that voiced this concern and this now very popular slogan, we want climate, we want system change, not climate change. So this is heard everywhere. This slogan was first coined in the CJN platforms. At that point of time, there are other movements, or maybe more than movements, there were NGO collectives like CAN, Climate Action Network, which is also a global network, but which is mostly NGO based. Whereas Climate Justice Now was not only NGO based, it was basically multiple movements, people's movements, NGOs more radical groups together. So these two till some point were the main two constituents of the climate movement globally. I'll come to India quickly, but to understand how the India groups formulated themselves or got together, you need to understand this one. So around 2008-9, this was coming to be quite prominent. In fact, the 2009 World Social Forum in Belém in Brazil, that was one forum where climate justice movement got a head start, because huge part of the World Social Forum, large part, was discussion around the climatic problems, the climate crisis, and then what kind of movements we need to build up. So in Belém, I think we faced a lot of these. We took a lot of discussion, a lot of very heated debates. And around just before that, 2007-8, in India, we started several, when I'm saying we, it is not only just Delhi-based groups. It is multiple groups. There was a Hyderabad-based collective of multiple groups called Hyderabad Platform. Then in Kolkata, there was a platform formed and which were focused on sustainability, climate, sustainability, and equity. So these three were, and which means you have to have the justice element. So these three were key focus areas of this. So in India, this started with these 3-4 groups: Delhi Platform, Hyderabad Platform, Kolkata Platform, because in the rural areas, we at that point up, we had very little understanding of what is this, very little even sort of awareness that what is the climate crisis issue, and what is this issue. A little bit people heard about those terms, but nothing more than that. So out of that, what many groups in India we did in 2008, we started pushing for a national platform. So ultimately 2009, we collectively held a large consultation meeting in Ranchi in Jharkhand. 2009, sometime in April, May, I forgot the exact month, where the India Climate Justice Platform was created. And at that point of time, something like 83 big groups, large networks like NAPM, National Alliance of People's Movement, came to that. NFF came to that, National Fish Workers Forum, which is probably the largest fish workers union in Asia. Then the forest workers, at that time, forest workers had only one national union. Now it is 3. They broke into 3 parts. So they came. Then the land rights movements people, they also joined. So this was a very large formation, the India Climate Justice, which formed in 2009. That was for the first time in India as a large collective from the civil society. We raised this as a climate justice issue. And one has to understand that in 2008, the government of India, not on their own, but under international pressure, formulated the so-called National Action Plan on Climate Change, NAPCC, which is not actually an action plan. It is a 49-page wishy-washy document. And when we challenged that, they said, the government people said, the Joint Secretary and all, no, this is just the framework. The states will come out with the SAPCC, the State Action Plan on Climate Change. That will be our government's side climate action. So these two went parallelly. The government took a decision and government came out with a plan in June 2008 with the NAPCC, National Action Plan on Climate Change. And the 2007-8 onwards, the civil society, taking climate justice as a perspective, they brought together a large number of people's movements and progressive and radical NGOs all together. As I said, something like 80 groups came together. And some of those groups were very large, like NAPM, NFF, and the Forest People's Movements, all of this. So that was the beginning in India. What happened in quickly, but I'll end by in 2-3 minutes, then I'll come down next round, because Aditya should also speak on this. What happened in between is in the international global platforms, things have started changing after 2009, because as most people probably, many people probably know, 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, which was my first COP, UNFCCC COP, actually turned the whole justice question upside down. Because till that point of time, it was very well accepted, the concept of differentiated responsibilities, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, CBDRRC, which was the key component of climate agreements. In Copenhagen, effectively, these started getting diluted. And in Cancun, in fact, some decisions were taken. Cancun was the next year, 2010, COP16. And COP is Conference of Parties. Parties are governments which are members to the UNFCCC Convention. So those are parties. It is not a political party. So these 2 years are also very critical in the concept of climate justice globally, because from a whatever happened on the ground might be different, but from a conceptual point of view, from an agreement point of view, right from Kyoto or even before from Kyoto, 1997, Kyoto Protocol, it was accepted that those countries which have contributed much higher to the creating the problem of climate crisis and created wealth and money and all and technology, they are responsible to a much larger extent. So they have a responsibility which is far larger than poorer countries which have not contributed in creating this problem. So that was CVDR-RC, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities. As I said, from 2009, the UNFCCC started diluting that. 2010, it was a large dilution, and ultimately in coming to Paris, 2015, it actually got very, very clearly sidelined, marginalized. Now everybody, and in Glasgow this year, everybody said that shared responsibility, common, but shared responsibility. So the differentiation and respective capacities got completely diluted. And the climate justice movements have responded to this very clearly by rejecting these concepts, by demanding that the responsibility and the capacity aspects, which are core to the justice angle, those who have not created the problem but are suffering the most. Because if you look at the Global Vulnerability Index, every year it is published by German Watch and many other groups. But the German Watch Global Vulnerability, Climate Vulnerability Index is most watched, most followed. If you look at that, out of the top 20 most vulnerable countries and 5 categories of vulnerabilities, climate vulnerabilities, India figures in 3, Bangladesh figures in 3, Pakistan figures in 3, Nepal figures in 2. So South Asia is very vulnerable. Along with Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia is very vulnerable, our region. But our region has contributed minimally, if you even now, historical response. So that justice aspect, and India, this came to head, as I said, in 2009, we formed the India Climate Justice Platform. For some years, it was very active. Then it came down a little bit. It became more of a listserv. And though we produced from 2008, I think the first civil society generated climate justice focused magazine, which was called Mosam. Some 9-10 issues we were able to bring up, 9-10-11 issues. I don't remember exactly. Those were the beginnings of climate justice movement in South Asia. And why I'm saying, end by saying this, when we talk about India and climate and ecological issues, you cannot talk only about India. The South Asian countries are marked by 3 very clear natural factors. One is the Himalayas. The second, 4 clear factors. Second is the southwest monsoon, which is not Indian monsoon, is the southwest, is South Asia's monsoon. The third is the 3 seas. And the fourth is we share a very large number of rivers. India and Bangladesh share 54 transboundary rivers. So you cannot think about like river flooding, other problems. You cannot think about India doing something, Bangladesh, excluding Bangladesh completely. Nepal doing something, excluding India. So those kind of, Pakistan essentially has 1 river, Sindh. And nearly 60% of Sindh's water depends on snow and ice melt. So you cannot think about India doing something and on its own, excluding its South Asian neighbors on the climate sphere. So I'll end there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come to some of the politics. And before that, Aditya, so in terms of, government policies, has there been, a history of policies on climate at all? I mean, there is now, but what's been some of the history around it, and what is climate politics?
Right. Um, it's quite interesting, actually. I mean, there is a history of it. I think maybe an interesting place to start is what we were just talking about, the National Action Plan on Climate Change that Mr. Dutta was just talking about. And he's right, because in a sense, what was happening at that time was there was, of course, these green shoots of climate activism, and people start talking about climate in the early to mid 2000s. But at the same time, there's a whole lot of international pressure. And there's this story of a G8 meeting in the German city of Heiligendamm, where at that point, India was invited as an observer, and Germany was chairing the meeting. And I don't know if this story is true or not, but apparently Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and Manmohan Singh had a sort of long walk where he impressed upon him the importance of countries like India and China sort of taking this global leadership role on the climate issue, because Germany was quite keen on sort of elevating climate, particularly in the G8 meeting. And in short order, China also came up with a national action plan, and they released it just before that, just in that period, the next few weeks, they released it. They released it just before the G8 Heiligendamm meeting. So there was already China had sent a benchmark. Germany was talking about this. So within 2 or 3 weeks of coming back to India, Manmohan Singh created this Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, which was at the national level. It had several ministers from various ministries in the national government, and it had a bunch of scientists and think tank policy type people from some well-known think tanks here. So CSE, TERI, some big climate think tanks. And they came up with this document that Mr. Dutta was just talking about, which is this National Action Plan on Climate Change, right? And it was supposed to be a framework. There was no state involvement at that time, and that only came much later. It came only about 2 or 3 years down the line. The states were sort of roped in because the central government realized it had very limited capabilities to get into that. But one of the key features of the NAPCC process is it was a very closed sort of group that sort of put this together, and it was mainly for international consumption, because what was happening at that point is immediately after that, Obama wins the election. He makes climate #1 on his agenda. And he says this really needs to be front and center. And he stakes a huge amount of his political capital and credibility on that 2009 Copenhagen conference that Mr. Dutta was just talking about, right? And that's why everything in climate politics really reversed, because the US went gangbusters on trying to make something happen. And so in a way, this document was essentially supposed to show India's leadership, its credibility in international forums, and place it alongside China in this new Asian century, so to speak. Right? So that's where it came from. I think what your audience would be sort of interested to know, or at least they might have already detected this pattern, that a lot of this comes due to international impulses, right?
Yeah.
The Global Vulnerability Index from German Watch, for example, is for a very long time, like Mr. Dutta was saying, they've said for a very long time, India, South Asia, extremely vulnerable. But this hasn't really factored in to the government's calculations about how climate policy should be made or should work. So it's a top-down sort of approach in the sense that it's responding to international impulses rather than a bottom-up responding to domestic impulses and domestic politics.
Yeah.
What is our vulnerability? What are economic opportunities and so on? That's broadly been how things have played out in recent years. So that's, I think, I'll just stop there and just say that's the broad nature of climate politics. But having said that, there are groups and there are NGOs, there are movements that do push the boundaries of what climate politics is at a domestic level, but then this can only go up, say, to the states. So far, we've not seen large collective national movements sort of push the central government to take different stances or policies based on their pressure, right? We've seen this in Brazil, and we see this now in South Africa. But we've not seen it to the same extent in India. And so I think there are many reasons for it, because we're a very large state, and a lot of the movements are focused on local environmental politics rather than larger climate issues. There's a question of whether environmental movements have converted to climate language, and not all of them have just yet. Like we were discussing on our previous call, the trade unions have been sort of on the fence. So there's this question of where is the larger movement, how is it coalescing and coming together, right? So there is this question of that. But I think there are some lessons that can be learned, and I don't think it's all bleak. I think there are plenty of things that we can do as individuals, but maybe that's something we're going to talk about later on. But I think I'll just stop here with this broad overview of the nature of politics and policy.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, we can just open I wanted to say to the audience, if you have any questions, you can open up. Since it's a small group, we can make it more of a discussion than a question and answer session. So any question that you can think of, you can raise your hand, or you can text it in the chat, and we'll take that. So one of the, I mean, because it's a climate justice issue, already there are signs of, refugee crisis because of climate. I mean, war itself we've seen in the last few decades, if I talk internationally, there is a huge refugee crisis. And Europe kind of has to deal with that, because Europe is actually not the @1 country to be taking refugees. Nevertheless, it's a big political issue over there. So, I mean, obviously, Soumya, both of you mentioned how it can't be just a national issue for that matter. For South Asia, we're all connected, these countries because of the Himalayas, the rivers, the sea waters, etc. And yet we don't. I mean, nobody politically talks about that, right? But so, I mean, the word refugee itself is a big problem. I'm just bringing that up because we've seen some of, a bit of a refugee crisis in South Africa when they were reaching ground zero or something. If you could talk about, both of you, just about how this, I think I vaguely remember that this this refugee issue even came up in the Security Council. And then it became this question, it becomes a question of, is it a security issue rather than, the impact? The security is because of, it's because of, what climate change is doing, right? And because of the fact that it is actually a social justice issue. So you can't just address refugee, because you can see India, and its neighboring countries could internally or within the boundaries face this crisis also in the future, right? If nothing is done. And the government, obviously, there is the bottom approach, and yet even if there are civil societies working on the ground, the policies are important. So maybe if we could discuss this a little bit. Yeah, either of you who wants to go first?
Yes, you can start, or if Aditya wants to start first,
No, please.
I think this is quite true. In fact, if you look at one report which came out last year, right now I am not recollecting, one study which came out last year, which showed, every year at this time, the climate issues, that is the kind of changes that is being driven by the climate crisis, are actually displacing more people than war and other ethnic strives, etc., are displacing. This was last year. Some report came out. And if I remember the figure correctly, it's around 30 million, 3 crores. So that's already a mind-boggling figure. And with only 1 million refugees Germany is shouting here. When I was in Bonn for the last COP, there were a lot of people who were very unhappy that 1 million people came in and security has gone down and this kind of thing is happening, that is happening. But what is happening already globally is, if it is 30 million, I have no way of verifying it. It is just, I'm quoting the study report, figure. 30 million already being displaced. And there are other studies which are showing, if we come down to South Asia, I'll give you actual example and the studies. Studies are saying by 2060, something like 50 million people, anything between 24 to 50 million people in Bangladesh might be displaced. And that means even if it is the lowest figure, say 25 million, 2.5 crore people. In fact, even during partition, even during the 1971 Bangladesh war, that many people were not displaced. During the Bangladesh war, something like 10 million people were displaced, which came as refugees from Bangladesh to India. So we are talking about a figure which is 2.5 times, with far harder borders, far bloodier borders. And so one can understand. And one has to understand that maybe not all areas of India. See, there are multiple problems where the climate crisis is creating climate-forced migrants. Unfortunately, the UN do not recognize climate factor. If somebody is displaced due to climate factor, as of now, UN do not recognize them as refugees. That has to be some political factor, war, civil rights, etc., etc. Of course, there are a lot of pressure on that. There are a lot of groups. Some groups in Bangladesh that I work with, they are also very much prominent in pushing this, that recognizing climate force migrants as climate refugees and refugee term, and all the facilities and benefits and things that should come along with that should be recognized. But if you just think what is happening in South Asia, what happened, what are the studies say, that is one. I have been working both in the Sundarbans for the last many years, Sundarbans, and also Tista Basin, which is North Bengal, Bangladesh, Sikkim. I was working in Tista Basin in West Bengal, Sikkim, and was quite surprised to find in Jalpaiguri district, large number of villages in and around Tista, there are people from the Sundarbans. They live in huts in very low-lying lands where the local people don't cultivate. I'm giving this example because people should understand what is already happening. And when I started approaching them, how come from the Sundarbans you came here? They said, after Aila, our land was completely unproductive for 10 years. Nothing grew. So we had no other option. We just came here. And since the North Bengal people here, they don't cultivate the very low-lying land because that often gets flooded. And these people from Sundarbans, they are used to land getting flooded, but this is not salt water. So this is still productive. Whereas once the salt water comes in the land, in the Sundarbans and coastal areas, it gets completely unproductive for many years. So thousands of people have already got displaced from climate vulnerable areas. If you go to Odisha, Kendrapada district, more than 20,000 families that we rough estimate of have already become climate refugees. Many other places after Amphan, lot of families have shifted out of different areas of Sundarbans and Purva Medinipur, East Medinipur. So the climate refugees are already being created. The same story in Bangladesh. I was visiting just before the lockdown. I was in Bangladesh early February 2020. February 10 to 16, I was in Bangladesh. First in the Sundarbans areas, then in the north, in the Brahmaputra Tista Basin, up to Chilmari. Chilmari is where Tista falls onto Brahmaputra. An entire range I was moving around and talking to villagers, training. I was conducting some trainings, etc. So there we found every village, some 5 to 10 families have shifted out. And I have a lot of photographic documents. They were showing us in the Tista, there are some banana plantains top is visible. Some bamboo top is visible. Some broken huts top is visible. So all the land, their house, their plantations, everything now is in the river. And this is increasingly happening because Tista, because of the climatic changes, very heavy, sudden, very heavy rains, flash floods, and huge amount of land loss, house loss, life loss has come down. Exactly same thing I saw in northern parts, northern Bangladesh, in the Tista, what they call chor. Chors are river islands, chor land. So large chor areas like Padamati's chor, Hussein's chor, where I were going, these are Bangladesh-India borders. The Bangladesh-India border runs through Hussein's chor and southern part of Padamati chor. Each of these chor, that is the river islands, some 20 to 25,000 families live. And many of them are every year losing their land and houses. It's very productive land. So they're not really poor. But if you go to this church, you will not find a single pakka structure except the primary school or the primary health center, if it is there. Entire church. And when I was asking them, why do you are earning quite a lot by agriculture? It's quite productive land, particularly potato and those other things. They said, we don't know if tomorrow our house and land will be there or not. Today I am sleeping, going to sleep. Tomorrow I don't know whether it will be there. So why to invest on house? We'll select the highest spot there and make a temporary house. So every house is sort of a kacha structure. So thousands and thousands of, maybe lakhs of families are already becoming climate refugees, have become climate refugees. We don't even understand that.
Yeah.
The last issue that I want to raise, that it's very important politically, because Aditya also mentioned this. I think we had in South Asia, we had a political process where South Asia cooperated. We had a SHARC. In the SHARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, climate was one of the clearly identified important areas. We had the Thimphu Declaration on climate change. We had the Dhaka Statement on climate change. We had the SARC Food Bank built up in Bangladesh. We have the SARC Climate Change Center in Bangladesh. So it is not that political process in South Asia has not happened. But once post 2014, I still remember we were there in the People's SARC meeting in Kathmandu in 2014. There was tremendous enthusiasm. A lot of things were happening. Post 2014, things completely collapsed. Any cooperation at the South Asian level collapsed because of India-Pakistan, this unusual playing political game playing. So it was not right that there was no political process in South Asia. It was a very good political process. Bangladesh came up with this climate action plan before India did. We must understand that. When I analyzed that in 2008, 8-9, Bangladesh climate action plan was much better than India's climate action plan. But Bangladesh also went down in climate action. I'm saying the government action after that. So there was a very clear cooperative political process in SHARC, that is in the South Asian region. And we understood earlier at the political level that we must cooperate, collaborate. We took decisions together. As I said, if you look at the Thimphu Declaration, Dhaka Statement, both of these, they are very clear. But after 2014, for 15 onwards, we went down the hill, and now we have absolutely no cooperation on the climate, almost. So that's a big situation.
Yeah. So Aditya, you want to add to this about the climate refugee issue?
Yeah, I do actually. In a way, there are very few issues on Earth for which the system of nation states that we have is as badly placed for as climate change. Both in solving the emissions issue, because there's all these divisions based on national boundaries, and in terms of dealing with the outcomes. So you have refugees moving from one country to another. It incites all sorts of nationalistic passions, right?
Yeah.
In many ways, solving the refugee question comes down to how much can you dissolve the differences between these nation states and create some sort of collective solidarity or identity that moves beyond individual sort of tribal or nationalistic loyalties. And that's obviously not an easy thing to do. Just to add to the examples Mr. Dutta was giving, whenever Bangladesh has a major flood that occupies a third of water of the country, there's immediately an uptick in influx of affected women into Kolkata's red light areas.
Oh.
So there were a bunch of reportage that Reuters did, I think 2017, I think when that big flood happened, and then even before that. So there are all these intersecting vulnerabilities. And so it's obviously not a problem that can be solved very easily. And I think we all know the state of politics in the Northeast and the East when it comes to cross-border migration, right?
Yeah.
In solving this, it requires a compact and a compromise at 3 levels. If you don't have this compact at 3 levels, there's really not much hope. The first is at the local level, we need to have some sort of internal understanding about how we're going to deal with climate refugees and migrants between the states of India. Because it can't be that 2 or 3 eastern states handle the whole influx, or 2 or 3 western states of Pakistan, because the Indus is such a big vulnerability when it comes to climate. Can't just be states. And that's essentially what Europe is facing. And who really takes on the burden of this? The second is at the national level. Our foreign policy needs to be far more in tune with the realities of future climate refugees, in the sense that we need to be investing money in climate resilience and economic development in our neighbors far more than we have been, with the explicit sort of lens of climate justice. Right? That has to be front and center in our development assistance to other countries, right? And the third bit is globally, there has to be an understanding that, yes, we want climate justice and we want money coming from developed countries here. But the fact is, a lot of that will also be to resettle refugees, to give them a reasonable life, give them dignity. And so specifically when it comes to refugee flows, we need a separate process for the transfer of monies from the global north to the global south. Because otherwise it doesn't make sense that you have some money coming for adaptation, but absolutely no money for the refugee problem, which is disproportionately going to affect the global south. It's not really always going to be Europe that gets the brunt of it. Ultimately, when stuff really hits the fan, it's going to be countries in South Asia and Africa that have to deal with that. I mean, the number one settlement area for Palestinian refugees is not Europe. It's not the United States. It's Jordan. Jordan is a country of refugees.
And talking of that area itself, sorry to cut you. I mean, even the Syrian war, there is the angle of climate refugees. It's not talked about as much as maybe it should, but there is that angle. And talking of the Jordan River, a lot of the politics in that region is around the river. I've traveled quite extensively in that area, right from where the river originates. And as you travel down, you totally see how this plays a very important role in the whole. We don't want to get into that, the whole Palestine issue, but it plays a very important role. That's a good example of how a river, and it's the same with the rivers originating in the Himalayas. Sorry, go ahead, Aditya.
No, I just want to say that, I mean, it requires a massive change in political thinking. I mean, because I think the World Bank has an estimate that we'll have something like 140 million climate refugees by 2050, right? 140 million refugees is a whole lot of people. That's 1/10 of the population of India, that's a lot of people to be resettled. And I just feel sometimes it's a very limited conversation about what justice means, because it's how do we make sure that your emissions balance out in the long run with mine. But the fact is, we're going to get into this position where a lot of people are going to have very terrible lives, and the countries we move to aren't going to have the capacity to handle this. And so if you're talking about north-south flows, then it has to be about this too, right? There has to be a agreement around this. And the problem is, we'll wait until the first crisis, the second crisis, the third crisis will be 2060 before they start talking about it. By then, the political cat will be out of the bag and political stability will be affected. That's what I worry about, honestly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really, I feel it's so remarkable that the nation states. I mean, it's a whole political discussion we could go into. Who knows? This may even change the the boundaries. Like post, you could say it's really in the 20th century where we saw these defined boundaries of nation states. And in a way, the whole refugee crisis kind of dilutes it. It brings up the question of boundaries. They're not as fluid as they were in the past, and this kind of really challenges governments. Are you gonna like make boundaries everywhere, like say the Mexico-US boundary, or Bangladesh India boundary? And it's it may, we don't know how this is gonna further unravel, but the refugee crisis is probably gonna like impact a lot of things, including how nation states will be governed in the future. I know we can keep talking about this, but Aditya, yesterday when we were discussing, you talked a little bit about how, like, coming back to what anyone can do, because it's like too big an issue. How does one weave all this into one's life, or how, like, we touched upon how this is not even an issue for any political campaign, for any election. And we have in India, you have elections all the time, literally. So how does if someone has, since we're coming close to the hour, if somebody, you wanted someone to go back with what can be done, or just small things, how does somebody really weave into it? And how if somebody is involved in activism, how can we make this an issue which really, the discourse changes in terms of how we, to talk about this? If you could like talk about this a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is something I'd be curious to hear what the audience thinks about this question. What do we do as individuals?
Yeah.
What Mr. Dutta thinks about it, because it's something that I am constantly trying to think about and trying to figure out, what exactly can we do and what is the right thing to do. And a lot of the problem, if I look deeply, a lot of the problem is, and I think we discussed this, climate is such a big issue, right? It's everything. Yeah. International politics, it's your local river, it's your politicians, it's all of these things. And how do you tackle something like this, right? The concept of climate justice, which we've been talking about over and over again, is pretty much justice about every single inequity and issue that we've faced over the history of humankind, or at least in the last 400 years. Yeah. So how exactly do you think about it? I think a couple of things upon reflection that might be useful to share. I don't know how useful it is, but the first is to rephrase the question, right? I don't think we should be talking about how do you tackle climate. It's how do you work climate into your public engagement in civic life, right? So if you're focusing on health, for example, then the question is, how do you think about climate in your health activism? Or if you're talking about things like reducing the vulnerability of people living on the streets, then how do you work climate into that? So there you might go down this path. How do I reduce their heat vulnerability, right? How do I make sure they have water when water stress increases? How do I think about people who are migrants or refugees coming into a city like Delhi? I'm sure now if you go out today and do a poll of how many people under flyovers are actually here because of natural disasters and other issues, I'm sure it'll be at least like 5-10%, right? Yeah. Because it sort of keeps floating up to the surface every time there is something happens in this country. There are these movements, right? And the nub of it, the core point I'd like to make is activism should be whatever activism means to you. Then that issue will always have an angle of vulnerability that's climate related. And I think that's the core effect that we want to capture and act on, right? The issues we start caring about within health and street vulnerability will start changing as nature changes, as the climate changes. That's actually not think about climate first, think about whatever you're doing, and then how does climate affect that? So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really changing the discourse. I mean, in Delhi, you often hear people say, "Oh, these Bangladeshis, they keep coming." They may not necessarily be. Firstly, you don't know that. Secondly, they may not necessarily be Bangladeshi per se, right? I mean, you have internal refugees as well, and this is obviously going to cause a lot of conflict within, interstate as well. But yeah, changing that discourse. I mean, that's a very good point you bring about, especially those who are involved in some, some form of activism, whether it's health or it's whatever. How to kind of, change the narrative and bring in the speed, integrate it in a way. I think that's a very important message to to take back, I think. And I would definitely like to kind of, work more on this, because one of FFEC's objective with these webinars is and the last one is, about future ahead and some of the solutions. And we want to bring together some of the organizations that are working, on this issue, and see what FFEC, this is not something that FFEC has worked on at all, right? But to your point about health or about education, or I mean, there are a lot of migrants that FFEC works with, because most of the Jhuggi area where our center is close to are migrants, and we've actually never talked to them about this. What was the reason they moved? I mean, they come for jobs, but really, what's there's might be something more. So I would definitely like to kind of, see what we can do about that, about heat. This year it's been extremely cold as well. So I want to open it. I mean, ask again. Doesn't anybody have any questions? Because I mean, we're a little over the hour, but we can take a few questions if somebody has. Before I ask anything more, I do want to wrap up soon.
I just have one question.
Yeah.
Like the earlier when we were discussing, actually both of the speaker discussed about how Manmohan Singh, when he went to the G8 meeting in Germany, and Angela Merkel forced her to make something plan of that. So recently at COP26, there was a very famous speech, it got very highlighted also in India, by Vijay Prasad, highlighting how the Western countries are forcing all the products and everything is being made either in China or in Bangladesh. How can you expect that pollution will decrease simultaneously? You are also forcing them to produce more. So first thing, and in addition to that, basically in India, in every policy, whether recently we saw how the pollution increases, and the first thing that the government or even the Supreme Court, they do is to ban the construction work. But the burnt has to be faced by the poorer section who are working on a daily wage basis, and they stop getting their wages. In climate discussion, still in India, that class factor is not discussed. So how the policies are going to really implemented at the at the very end of the class base. So how do you see that, the contractual change? Both of the speaker, anyone who wants to respond to that.
See, one misconception I want to point out is the Western countries are forcing us to buy old things. This is a very rhetorical statement. Any market economy, and India has become a market economy.
Just to correct, actually, I was not saying that they are forcing us to buy, but they are forcing us to make, not us, especially in China. Like most of the American products are made in China or in Bangladesh, whether clothing system or their electronic part are being made in China or Bangladesh.
This is also, see, there are two, three different factors. And this has started happening much before the climate crisis became prominent. See, the offshoring, outsourcing, and outsourcing the quote unquote dirty industries, more labor intensive industries, that has started happening 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, but it is from the 80s it is going on. In fact, so almost 35, 40 years. So that is not directly connected with climate. But the problem is, yes, there is a connection in the sense that the emission, which is called embedded emission, like if you calculate the emission that Americans, material that Americans consume, and the amount of emission that has gone into it, that is the embedded emission, then the emission, total emission of CO2 emission or total CO2 equivalent emission will go up by 30 to 35%. So those kind of issues are there. But I think this issue of market economy, the globalization process, these are also reasons for increasing of consumption. In fact, if you look at both the emission graph and consumption graphs, they have very close, they follow each other very closely. The pattern follows very closely. So that is there. But I also disagree partly with that. What also Aditya has said, I agree that general trend is not so much, but people, the trade unions, the people who are at the ground in the cities, in the slums, they are not at all bothered. In fact, over the last few years, people have started taking notice. It has not happened much earlier. It has, in the last few years, people have started taking notice. In fact, in the discussion, earlier days discussion, I just mentioned also. In fact, the National Fish Workers Forum, which is the collection of unions from all across the coastal states where fish workers unions are there, and this is a fully unionized organization. They were thinking of it for several years. This last year, I conducted a 2-day workshop for them to understand and start action. And they have been pushing for this on some of this. There is, I also conducted another workshop with Delhi Shramik Sangathan. You mentioned construction workers, Delhi Shramik Sangathan or Shramik DSS. They are, one of their major constituents are construction workers. So what they are noticing, they don't know yet fully well that this is due to these factors. But the reasons of these increasing heat waves, the heat index, all these are actually hitting them. All kinds of manual workers, physically, those who are working physically. Farmers are there, but much more than that, urban poor, the urban working class. So they have started taking notice. In fact, one large formation that we have called South Asian People's Action on Climate Crisis, SAPAC, one of the main constituents is trade unions, or are trade unions. So one of the major constituent is trade unions. So it's true that the scale and the spread that we need, it has not happened, but people are really now waking up, some in some areas. But the problem is, see, in a country and economy like us, particularly with the situation that, let me very clearly say, this government has created again and again, people are under tremendous pressure just to earn a living or just to protect their livelihood or just to protect their lives. Like even Muslims, what would they prefer? What would they prioritize? They will prioritize survival, or they will prioritize the climate larger, more vague and more difficult to understand climate issue. So this government has forced people, a very large number of people, into even tighter corners just for survival in multiple dimensions. So that has also caused people to prioritize what in their understanding is immediate survival. And that's where I think whatever, and I have a little bit of warning to you, Yashmin, when you said you would like to bring together all of them, please be very careful. A lot of groups have tried this bringing together coordination. Groups don't like it. So unless you have ground level work, unless you are very grounded with a fairly large spread, people will not like someone coming on top and trying to coordinate. This is a very bad trend in India. We have seen again and again. So that unless
sorry, I didn't mean coordinate. We can't. We just want to like join some other organizations and see what local action we can be involved with.
Careful watcher of these words. So I have seen this and I have seen the reactions. So please be careful. Unless you
I
work
see
on
what
the
you mean.
ground,
Yeah.
you build up your credibility. Please don't try to bring together a lot of groups. That's kind of work.
Yeah.
Don't take it.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Good point.
it's one bit of warning. But what I'm saying is this will work with groups who are facing the brunt of the climate crisis directly. See, as I said, for 10 years, I have been constant touch, lot of dialogue with the fish workers all across India. Only after Amphan last year, 2020, not last year, 2020. Oh, sorry, this is already 2022. So Amphan, May 2020. After that, these unions came to me. After Yash, they finalized their stand. Some of the predictions that I did and IMD didn't do, that came true. And they also, many of these people told me when I visited, that Dada, we'll have to now leave our homes because our home is gone, our land is salinized, salty, our drinking water source is saline now, and the ponds that we had for fish, those got salinated. So the fish have all died. So what do we do for living? So people are moving out. So in this kind of situation, people have seriously taken up the issue of climate crisis, but this is a very limited number and you cannot depend people getting maximum hit and then turning to action. So we'll have to probably find a better way. But as of now, what I saw is that people who are getting very badly impacted, like the West workers are facing this repeatedly again and again. In Jabalpur, in one large meeting, Kaushala Devi, she herself is a West worker. She told us that इतना गर्मी हमें बीच-बीच में मिला, हमने 2 बार तो मैं तो बेहोश होकर गिर गई. तो ऊपर में when she to collect. So this kind of impacts are happening on people, and those groups, if you try to reach out to them, try to build understanding and actionable points. Like some of our colleagues are working with a collective of group in Bhuj to build a people-oriented heat action plan. There are cities have their government heat action plans, but many of them, even people there, they don't know the government has a plan or not. Like how many of Delhi people know that Delhi government had a climate action plan earlier, and the revision has already also been done. So most people in Delhi don't even know that Delhi government has a climate action plan. So this abscess. Similar story with every state. So that's what my understanding is. People who are, last point, people who are getting badly hit, directly hit, they will be far more sort of responsive. They will be far more eager to take action and to listen to people rather than going to anyone, anywhere.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Any last thoughts, comments, Aditya?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Shoaib was saying, and I thought he brought up a very important point about what is the burden going to be on the poorest people in our society, right? And there's this World Inequality report that just came out a few weeks ago that shows that the top 10% is effectively emitting something like 4 or 5 times more emissions in the middle 40% or the bottom 50% of Indian society. So there is an important, when we talk about CBDR, this construct that Soumya ji was mentioning earlier, common but differentiated responsibility, right? Like what the West is supposed, what India is supposed to. There's also an internal CBDR, which is what is internally within India, what is the distribution of resources and what will climate change about the distribution of resources, right? You can go down the unequal path or you can try and make it converge. And that's a big political choice when it comes to climate politics, because the poorest are emitting so much less than the rich. That and also just one sort of clarification to what Soumya ji was saying about the rise of movements and so on. It's true, there are things that are happening now, but one of the features is we've never actually had national policy making take grassroots voices, civil society voices into consideration in a systematic way. I think that was my point over the last 20 years. So NGOs, think tanks, grassroots organizations, they make petitions, they comment on policies, but then having a systematic institutional process where every time you come out with a statement about climate, you've actually talked to all the stakeholders. That we don't have. That actually is something Brazil and South Africa, all those countries that I was talking about, they do have, or they try to have. Right? So that I just want to say that a lot of this conversation and all these exciting things that Soumya was mentioning kind of has to work against the grain of existing policy making, because you don't have the spaces to just get involved and say what you want to say, right? You have to kind of be as creative as possible in making your voice heard. So it's very different. So that was, I think, what I was trying to say is there's no institutional place where you can actually make these comments, which is why you've never had this movement sort of blossom at the national level, right?
Yeah.
I hope it's
very true. And I remember when we had our first conversation, you said, like, if you just think of policies and government, it seems very hopeless, but you have some hope. From the like bottoms up approach, there is some hope that you have, right? You see local bodies or people's movements, kind of, like you said, weave it into daily lives. Then there is some hope of it even reaching a point where you can say, even question your members of parliament or your elected members from your local areas, right? This is not a topic that ever comes up. So if you want to say anything on that, Aditya, otherwise I think we'll just kind of end it. Yeah.
Sorry, I think question, so I'll have to add something to finish.
Yeah, sure.
I'll take leave.
Yeah, do go ahead, because we are quite, over the hour. So yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks.
I just maybe just one last response to what you were saying with the policy stuff. In fact, there is reason to be hopeful even about policy, because India has actually been doing not a terrible job, quite a decent job in trying to stimulate investment in renewables and get solar.
Yeah.
But there's so many unexplored parts of this. All the things we touched upon today: inequality within the country, refugees, all these local level issues. So there are all of these things that aren't touched yet, and I think a lot of action will have to be mobilized just to bring those things onto the agenda. So yeah, that's the work we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a big topic that you can kind of, go delve into each of the the small things that we discuss, but we can do it another time. So I want to thank you, Aditya, and we maybe at some point we can talk a little more about what we can do. Say, we talked a little bit about it. Heat is an example you gave, and we can discuss that, because I often thought about what can be done in, say, the Jhuggi area, because you kind of have some flexibility in the sense that, okay, if they don't have any, like, say, electricity power connection, then is there something something that can be done that addresses this, which will kind of bring it into one of their issues, and we're kind of bringing in the climate factor into it. I just as an example. So yeah, if anyone else, well, I'm gonna say let's. We don't have really any questions, but either way, we just want to wrap it up. And thanks, Aditya, once more. I'm glad, even if not many people join, I'm glad we had this very interesting discussion, and we have a recording of it. So we're going to share it, and hopefully we'll think of what next we can do, if anything, collaborate on. Thanks. Okay, everybody who joined. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.